Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm an American citizen. I pay both local and federal taxes, but I don't have representation in Congress, and it's because I live in Washington, D.C. But it doesn't have to be this way. For the last 220 years, we have been fighting for our vote to be heard, but without a voting representative or senator in Congress, we don't have an advocate to help make our case. And that's where you come in. Over the course of this video, I'll explain how D.C. becomes a state, the preservation of a federal district, why D.C. statehood matters to you, and how you can get involved. So let's dive right in. Let's start with the basics. What needs to happen for D.C. to become a state? Well, it's really quite simple. First, the District of Columbia needs to vote on a referendum to ensure the people living in D.C. actually want to become a state. This occurred in 1982 and again in 2016. And in both votes, D.C. residents voted overwhelmingly for D.C. to become a state. We also voted on a state constitution, promised to be governed by a Republican form of government, and defined our boundaries. Next, the House would introduce and vote on a bill to admit the residential and commercial parts of D.C. as a state, reserving a 2-square-mile federal district as required by the Constitution. The House passed the bill in 2020, but because it's a new session of Congress, it has to be reintroduced and voted on again. The bills for both the House and Senate have been introduced in the 117th Congress, and the House will be voting on it this spring. Then, the bill goes to the Senate for a vote. Once it passes both chambers, it heads to the President's desk for signature. And that's it! D.C. becomes a state. And don't worry, the referendum vote doesn't expire, so we aren't time limited waiting for Congress to act. I should also add that we're not creating a new process. This has been done before. The Constitution states that the Federal District of Columbia can be no larger than 10 miles square, but doesn't set a limit on the minimum size of the capital. In fact, the boundaries of D.C. shrank in 1865 when the D.C. residents along the Virginia border voted to go back to Virginia, and the Congress quickly approved this. The process we're using to approve statehood is also not new. Our process is called the Tennessee Plan because, you guessed it, it's the exact model Tennessee followed to become a state. Now, I'm sure you have a few questions. What will happen to our capital? Will the United States still have one? And what would our flag look like? Establishing D.C. as a state would not eliminate the capital. As you can see on this map, a 2-mile portion of the current district would remain as a federal enclave. It includes a majority of our federal government buildings and the National Mall. This way, we would preserve a distinct capital without disenfranchising hundreds of thousands. Very few people actually live right around the federal buildings and monuments. And our flag, well, here it is. Looks pretty similar to our current flag, doesn't it? The first time I looked at it, I couldn't even tell the difference. If you're watching this video, you likely don't actually live in D.C., so you may be wondering, what does this have to do with me? Quite a lot, actually. First, did you know that the congressmen and women you elected may review every piece of D.C. legislation, including our budget, before it can be enacted? That means they're spending less time working on issues you elected them to address. In fact, Congress has, in the past, spent time debating on where our dog parks were to be located. Second, you're all members of the League of Women Voters because you value and support its vision. A democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. Well, right now, 700,000 people cannot participate in our democracy just because of where they live. American citizens, some of whom fought in the Revolutionary War, had their right to vote to be represented in Congress and any local government wiped out overnight when Congress took over D.C. in 1801. The right to vote is a fundamental principle of our democracy. When more Americans can participate in our elections, the outcome better reflects who we are as a country. What have we learned so far? Establishing D.C. as a state is crucial to strengthening our democracy and restoring the vote to 700,000 people. Congress must be the avenue we use to establish D.C. as a state. While the path ahead seems daunting, we are encouraged that more people are finally understanding that the people who live in D.C. don't have the same rights that people who live in the 50 states do. And given that Washington, D.C. Admission Act has already passed the House once, it also seems that people are understanding that Congress must fix this problem. And it will take all of us, regardless of where we live, to make this happen. So call your reps. Tell them how you feel about statehood for the people of D.C. Remember, those of us that live in DC don't have voting representation in Congress, so it is up to your legislatures. The League also has a petition on our website. We're trying to collect 10,000 signatures. Help us exceed that goal. And of course, educate your friends and family. Thanks so much for your interest and support for full rights for DC citizens.